The snowstorm hit unexpectedly. One minute, Emily and her dog Max were enjoying a quiet hike through the mountains, and the next, they were caught in a fierce blizzard. Emily had been exploring the remote wilderness, seeking a little peace and escape from the chaos of her daily life. But now she was in the fight of her life, and it wasn't just her own survival that weighed on her mind. It was Max, too. As the wind howled, snow whirling around them in a relentless blur, Emily tried to keep her bearings. She could barely see anything through the thick white curtain that surrounded her. Max, usually a fearless dog, was shivering and pressing close to her leg, looking up at her with wide, fearful eyes. Emily, too, felt the cold creeping into her bones. She had thought she was prepared. She had warm clothes, enough food, and a map. But nothing could have prepared her for the storm's ferocity. The temperature was dropping fast. Emily's fingers were already numb, and she could barely move her toes inside her boots. It was like the cold was seeping into her very soul. She glanced at Max, his fur matted with snow. He had always been by her side, a loyal and energetic companion. But now the little dog seemed as defeated as she felt. They had ventured too far off the trail, and now they were completely lost. Every direction looked the same, nothing but endless white snow and the gray sky above. Emily tried to think. She had to find shelter. She remembered seeing a ranger, stationed further along the path. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing she could focus on. If they could make it there, they might be safe. She clutched the map tightly, but even with it in her hands, the path ahead was unclear. The snow was falling so thickly now that the ground was becoming impossible to distinguish from the sky. The world around her was dissolving into an endless, empty whiteness. Her breath came in sharp bursts, and with every exhale, clouds of vapor filled the air. She wasn't sure if it was just the cold or if it was the exhaustion, but her mind was starting to feel foggy. Her feet felt like blocks of ice, and she was stumbling now. She had been hiking for hours, and the fatigue was overwhelming. Max tugged on his leash, pulling her forward, but even he seemed to be struggling. For a moment, Emily stopped and looked around, trying to get a sense of where she was. The snowstorm seemed to mock her. It was like the storm had swallowed up everything, every landmark, every direction. She couldn't even tell if the sun had set or if it was still afternoon. The sky had become an unending sheet of gray, making it impossible to tell time. She checked her phone again, but there was no signal. Just the silent, blinking screen that reminded her how alone she was. It was then that she felt the first real wave of panic. She wasn't just cold now, she was terrified. Max, sensing her fear, started to whine softly, his tiny body shaking. Emily kneeled down and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. She tried to comfort him, whispering softly to calm him down, but it was hard to keep her own fear at bay. The storm was relentless, and Emily realized that she was not going to make it out of this alive if she didn't find help. Her hands were frozen, her legs stiff, and her thoughts scattered. What if no one came? What if she and Max just disappeared, out here swallowed by the storm? She tightened her grip on Max, trying to hold back tears. They had always been a team. She had adopted him as a puppy, and they had been inseparable ever since. He was her best friend, her comfort in the hardest times. And now here they were, both caught in a situation neither could control. Her thoughts kept circling around, wondering if anyone would miss them, if anyone even knew they were out here. She had always been careful, always planned her hikes. But now, in the middle of this blizzard, all her careful planning seemed pointless. Emily's breath was coming, in short gasps. The cold was suffocating, and she could feel her body shutting down. She was losing the battle. The storm was too much, the darkness was closing in, and all she could do was hold on to Max as if he were the only thing that could keep her grounded. She told herself over and over that she would not give up, but it was hard, so hard. As she hugged Max closer, trying to share what little warmth she had left, the harsh reality began to settle in. She had no way of knowing how far they were from safety, and with the storm intensifying, there was little hope that anyone would find them in time. The thought that they might not survive this made her heart ache. But she wasn't just worried about herself. What about Max? How could she let something happen to him? He had been with her through everything, the highs and the lows, and now they were facing the biggest challenge of their lives together. But even with all her love for him, there wasn't much she could do in the face of nature's unforgiving power. The wind howled even louder, pushing her back, forcing her to huddle closer to Max. Her body was no longer cooperating with her mind. Every movement felt like an effort, every breath like it was her last. She closed her eyes, not sure if it was because she was too tired to keep them open or because she was preparing herself for the end. It was as if time had stopped, and there was nothing left but the cold. In those quiet moments, as the storm raged around them, Emily thought about all the little things she would miss. Her morning coffee, the sound of Max's bark, the warmth of the sun on her face during the summer months. It was strange how the things you take for granted in life become the things you long for the most when you're faced with losing them forever. She thought about her family, her friends, and how they would feel if they ever found out what had happened to her. Max licked her face, his tongue cold against her skin, pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. She opened her eyes and looked at him. In his eyes, she saw the same fear she felt, but also something more, a sense of loyalty, a sense of trust. He had always believed in her, and now, as they sat together in the snow, she realized that maybe she had to believe in something, too. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance they could survive this. But the storm didn't care about what they believed in. It didn't care about their love, their friendship, or their bond. It was just the harsh reality of nature. And as Emily held Max tighter, her breath growing more shallow and her strength waning, she knew they were running out of time. But there was one thing she wasn't willing to give up, the hope that someone, somehow, might still come to their rescue. And so in the midst of the howling wind and the blinding snow, Emily clung to that sliver of hope. With Max by her side, she closed her eyes, waiting for what might come next. As the storm raged on, Emily's situation grew even more desperate. The snow had fallen so thick and fast that she could no longer see anything around her. The path she had been following was completely buried under a blanket of snow, and she was left with no clear direction. The wind whipped fiercely, causing her to stumble and lose her footing. Her body felt like it was made of stone, stiff and cold, and she could feel her energy draining away with each passing moment. Max, her loyal dog, was still by her side, but even he seemed to be struggling. His small body was covered in snow, and his paws left tiny prints in the otherwise untouched ground. Despite his usual boundless energy, he was shivering, his breathing ragged and his steps slow. Emily tried to coax him forward, but it was clear that the cold was taking its toll on both of them. Every step felt like it took more effort than the last. Her limbs were numb and the cold air stung her lungs with every breath she took. She reached down to pet Max, trying to comfort him, but her hands felt frozen, and she could barely move her fingers. Her thick gloves were no match for the biting chill, and she had already lost feeling in most of her fingers. It was as though her body was slowly shutting down, one part at a time. Emily's mind was foggy, and it was becoming harder to think clearly. She tried to remember how long it had been since the storm had started, but time seemed to have blurred together. Her thoughts were scattered, and the only thing she could focus on was the overwhelming cold. She had always prided herself on being prepared for situations like this. She had brought extra layers of clothing, food, and water, but none of that seemed to matter now. The storm was unforgiving, and Emily realized with a growing sense of dread that she might not make it out alive. She could feel her strength slipping away, and the more she tried to move forward, the harder it became. She had always considered herself strong physically and mentally, but now in the face of nature's fury she felt helpless. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience, it was life-threatening. She knew that if she didn't find shelter soon, her body would shut down completely. The thought of being lost, of freezing to death in the middle of nowhere, was a terrifying reality that she couldn't escape. Max, too, seemed to sense the danger. He was no longer pulling on the leash or eager to keep moving forward. Instead, He stuck close to her, his small body trembling as he looked up at her with wide eyes. Emily bent down to pet him again, trying to reassure him, but even her voice sounded weak and distant. She couldn't help him. She couldn't even help herself. And that was the most frightening part. With every step, the storm seemed to get worse. The snowflakes felt like tiny needles against her skin, and the wind howled with a force that made her ears ache. She looked around, hoping for some sign of shelter or safety, but the snow had transformed everything into a featureless, white landscape. There were no trees, no rocks, no landmarks to guide her. The world had become a vast, empty nothingness. Emily's vision was blurring, and she could feel her body growing weaker by the minute. She tried to take a deep breath, but her chest felt tight, as if the cold air had frozen her lungs. She staggered forward, her steps slow and unsteady, and glanced down at Max, who was now trailing behind her. His fur was matted with snow, and his little legs were barely lifting off the ground. Emily's heart ached as she saw how much he was struggling. He wasn't going to make it if they didn't find shelter soon. Desperation began to set in. Emily knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to keep stumbling forward, hoping for the best. The storm was too powerful, and they were too far from safety. The reality of their situation was sinking in, and the weight of it almost crushed her. She wasn't just worried about herself anymore. She was terrified for Max. He had been her companion for years, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and the thought of them both freezing to death in the snow was unbearable. Emily's body was starting to shut down. Her limbs felt heavier with each step, and her mind was slipping further from her grasp. It was as if the storm was taking over, leaving nothing behind but the cold. She felt herself growing numb, not just in her body, but in her mind as well. It was like she was drifting, detached from the world around her. She thought about sitting down and closing her eyes, just for a moment, but she knew that if she did, she might never get up again. The thought lingered in her mind, and it almost felt like a relief. But she knew she couldn't give up, not while Max was still depending on her. Max, sensing her faltering energy, nudged her hand with his nose, as if trying to remind her that they were in this together. Emily smiled weakly, her heart swelling with love for him. She didn't know how much longer they could keep going, but she couldn't let him down. Not now. With a great effort, Emily forced herself to take another step. She could barely feel her legs anymore, but she couldn't stop. Not when Max was still walking beside her, despite his exhaustion. They were a team, and that thought kept her moving forward even when every part of her body screamed for her to stop. The storm had become a monstrous force, but Emily refused to let it defeat them. She would fight, even if she didn't know how much strength she had left. The snow seemed to close in on them, wrapping them in a world of white. Emily's mind was racing, trying to think of anything that could save them. She remembered the ranger station, a small outpost she had seen on the map earlier. It felt like a distant memory now, but she clung to it as if it were the last thread of hope. She looked down at Max, whose tiny legs were moving slower than ever. His fur was caked in snow, and his eyes were wide with fear. He was struggling, but he was still there, still with her. That thought gave her a burst of determination. She had to keep going, for Max. But the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind howled louder, and the snow whipped harder. The world around them had become a blur of white, with no clear path or direction. Emily's vision was failing her, and her body was on the verge of collapse. She knew they were running out of time, but she couldn't stop now. She had to keep moving even if she didn't know where she was going. And then, just as Emily felt like she couldn't take another step, something unexpected happened. In the distance, through the snow and the wind, she saw a shape, a figure, moving toward them. It was barely visible at first, but as the figure got closer, Emily realized that it was a person. A real person. She couldn't believe her eyes. Was this a hallucination, or had help really arrived? The figure grew clearer, a man dressed in winter gear, moving swiftly through the storm. Emily's heart leaped with hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone had come, Someone had found them. In that moment, she knew that they weren't done yet. She still had a chance. Emily's mind raced as she saw the figure approaching through the snow. For a moment, she thought it might be a hallucination, a trick of the freezing cold and exhaustion. Her blurry vision made everything seem far away, and the storm had been so relentless that she wasn't sure what was real anymore. But as the figure grew clearer, she realized with a jolt of disbelief that it was indeed a person. The figure was a man, dressed in a thick winter coat, a snow cap pulled low over his face and large boots that left deep prints in the snow. He moved with purpose, cutting through the storm as though he had been walking in it for hours, like someone who knew exactly how to survive in the wilderness. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, even though she was still too weak to move or speak. Her heart hammered in her chest, the exhaustion and fear mixing with a new feeling: hope. For so long she had been sure they were alone, sure that the storm would swallow them both. She had given up so many times in her mind, telling herself that survival was impossible. But now, in front of her, was proof that she was wrong. There was someone here, someone who could help. The man seemed to be heading straight toward her. His figure was now unmistakable against the backdrop of the snowstorm. The wind howled around them, but Emily could hear his footsteps crunching through, the thick snow growing louder with each second. She wanted to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper, too weak to carry over the storm. Max, who had been beside her the entire time, let out a small whine as the man got closer. Emily looked down at him, and she saw his ears perk up, his tail wagging weakly despite the harsh cold. He must have sensed the same relief that Emily did. This was their chance. When the man finally reached them, Emily didn't have the strength to stand or move. She was barely able to lift her head to look up at him, but her eyes locked with his. He had kind eyes, the kind that immediately made her feel safe. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the howling wind. His tone was calm, steady, and full of concern. Emily could barely nod, and she felt herself shivering uncontrollably. The cold had taken its toll, and she felt herself fading, both physically and mentally. She needed help, and she needed it fast. I don't know how much longer I can go on," Emily managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. She felt like her body was no longer hers, as though it was a stranger to her, stiff and unresponsive. The man knelt down beside her, his movements quick but gentle. He wasn't panicked or rushed, and that gave Emily a small sense of reassurance. "Don't worry," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be okay now. I'm going to get you both out of here." He looked over at Max, who was still shaking beside her. The dog's small body was covered in snow, and his breath came in short, labored gasps. The man reached out, gently petting Max's head. "You too, little guy," he said, his voice warm. "You're gonna be all right." Emily felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. For so long she had thought they were alone, stranded without hope. And now here was this stranger, this man who appeared out of nowhere, offering a chance at survival. She had no idea who he was or where he had come from, but she didn't care. All that mattered now was that he was here. The man stood up, brushing the snow off his coat, and pulled out a thermal blanket from his pack. "I need to get you out of the wind," he said. "We're going to head to shelter. Stay close to me." He gently helped Emily to her feet, though she could barely hold herself up. Her legs felt like lead, and she was sure she wouldn't have been able to walk without his support. He guided her, one arm around her waist, helping her move through the snow. Max trotted alongside them, though he was clearly struggling to keep up. Emily didn't care about the cold anymore, or how hard it was to walk. She just clung to the man's side, trusting him as he led the way. The storm was still intense, but with the man's steady presence beside her, she felt a small spark of hope. She couldn't believe it. Someone had found them. Someone had come to save them. As they walked, the man explained that he was a ranger, someone who had been out looking for hikers and anyone else who might have gotten caught in the storm. It was his job to patrol the area, especially when the weather turned as dangerous as it had. Emily's heart lifted a little more as she heard that. There was a plan, a way out. "I've been tracking the storm," the man said. "I saw the Conditions worsening and thought there might be someone out here who needed help. Glad I was right. He gave a small, reassuring smile, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth, despite the freezing wind. They walked slowly, carefully, with the man taking the lead. Max, though exhausted, was staying close, sticking to Emily's side like a true companion. The man kept glancing back to check on both of them, making sure they were doing all right. Emily could feel herself growing stronger, though only slightly. The steady rhythm of walking, the heat of the thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and the man's calm presence were enough to keep her going. After what felt like hours, they reached a small cabin, tucked away among the trees. The man had mentioned that it was a ranger's cabin, a place used for emergencies like this. Emily was too tired to feel anything other than relief when they stepped inside. It was warm, sheltered from the wind, and the fire crackling in the hearth made the space feel like an oasis compared to the storm outside. The man helped Emily sit down by the fire, wrapping her in another thick blanket and making sure Max was comfortable too. He quickly moved around the cabin, gathering supplies and starting a pot of hot tea. Emily couldn't believe how much better she felt, just from being inside, away from the storm. The warmth of the fire seeped into her frozen bones, and the numbness in her fingers and toes started to fade. She could finally breathe easier, and her foggy mind began to clear. "Stay here," the man told her gently. "I'll take care of you both." As he worked, Emily glanced down at Max. The dog had curled up beside her, his body still shaking. But now he seemed more relaxed. Emily reached down and scratched his ears, smiling at him weakly. They had made it. They had survived. It felt unreal. The man returned with the tea, handing her a cup. It was warm and soothing, and she drank it slowly, savoring the comfort it brought. The man sat down across from her, watching her carefully. "You're going to be okay now," he said, his voice soft. "I've been through storms like this before. You're in good hands." Emily could hardly find the words to express her gratitude. She had no idea what would have happened if the man hadn't shown up. She was sure they wouldn't have made it through the storm on their own, and now with the fire crackling and Max snuggled up beside her, she finally felt safe. The storm was still howling outside, but it didn't matter anymore. Emily and Max had been saved, not by luck, but by the help of a stranger who had appeared at exactly the right moment. As Emily leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire relax her aching muscles, she couldn't help but feel that for the first time in hours, everything was going to be okay. The warmth of the ranger's cabin wrapped around Emily like a comforting blanket, and as she sat by the fire, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. Her body still felt heavy from exhaustion, but the heat from the flames seemed to melt away the cold that had taken hold of her. She looked down at Max, who was curled up next to her, his fur still damp from the snow but much warmer now. His soft, rhythmic breathing was a reminder that they were no longer in danger. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin the air was calm. Emily sat in silence, savoring the moment of peace, her mind slowly clearing. The terror and desperation she had felt only hours earlier seemed like a distant memory, but as she sat there, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man who had saved them. She had so many questions, but for now she was content just to rest and regain her strength. There would be time later to learn more about the person who had found them in their darkest hour. The man moved around the cabin, making sure everything was in order. Emily watched him as he worked. He was focused, efficient, and calm, a stark contrast to the storm that still raged outside. His presence gave her a sense of safety that she hadn't felt in a long time. She could see that he was experienced in these kinds of situations. His movements were confident, and he seemed to know exactly what to do. He came over to her, sitting down next to the fire. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle but with a hint of concern. Emily smiled weakly. "Much better, thank you," she replied, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her voice. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us." The man gave a small nod. "It's my job," he said simply. "I patrol these mountains, especially when the weather turns bad. I've seen a lot of people caught in storms like this, so I try to stay ahead of it just in case. Emily nodded, grateful for his quick thinking. She couldn't imagine how difficult it must be to work in such harsh conditions, constantly battling the elements to keep people safe. She wondered how many others he had helped before her, how many lives he had saved. Max and I were lucky you were out here today, Emily said, glancing down at her dog, who was still curled up beside her. She reached down and gently stroked his fur. I wasn't sure if we were going to make it. The man looked at Max, who had fallen asleep beside her. His face softened as he watched the dog. Dogs are tough, he said. But he's lucky to have you with him. You're both lucky, really. Emily chuckled softly, though it was more of a tired laugh than anything else. I don't feel very lucky, she admitted. The storm came out of nowhere. I thought I was prepared, but I wasn't. I should have turned back sooner. The man shook his head. You did what you could. Sometimes the weather turns so quickly, and you're caught in it before you even know what's happening. It's a harsh world out here. All you can do is keep your wits about you and make the best decisions you can. Emily thought about that. She had done her best to stay calm, to stay focused. But in the end, it had been the man's presence that had made the difference. He had appeared at just the right moment, like a lifeline in a sea of snow. She didn't know who he was or why he had been there, but she was thankful for his timing. After a moment of silence, the man got up and moved to the stove. You should eat something, he said, reaching for a container. You've probably been out there for a while, and you'll need your strength if you want to make it through the storm. Emily nodded, realizing how hungry she was. She hadn't realized it before, but her body was telling her that it was time to refuel. The cold had drained her energy, and her stomach growled in protest. She hadn't eaten much during her hike, and now, after the ordeal of the storm, she was more aware than ever of how important it was to keep her strength up. The man handed her a bowl of warm stew, its rich smell filling the cabin and making Emily's mouth water. It's not gourmet, but it'll do the trick, he said. With a smile, Emily took the bowl gratefully and took a spoonful of the stew. It was simple, but the warmth and flavor filled her with comfort. She had no idea how long it had been since she had last eaten something hot, but it felt like the best meal she had ever had. The warmth of the stew spread through her body, and, with each bite, she felt a little more like herself again. As she ate, she noticed the man watching her carefully. He had a kind, steady presence that made her feel at ease, despite everything that had happened. He wasn't asking questions or pushing her to talk. He simply let her rest and recover at her own pace. It was as if he understood exactly what she needed, and that made Emily feel both grateful and safe. Once she had finished the stew, the man stood up and moved toward a small cot in the corner of the cabin. You should try to rest as much as you can, he suggested. It'll help you recover faster. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion pulling at her. She wanted to argue, to say that she couldn't rest just yet, but the truth was, she was too tired. The storm was still howling outside, and she knew they would need to wait it out. But there was no sense in fighting her body's need for rest. Max had already curled up at her feet, and she followed suit, wrapping herself in the blankets that the man had provided. She settled down on the cot, letting the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the cabin lull her into a sense of security. She didn't know how long she had been awake or how much longer the storm would last, but for the first time in hours, she felt like she could finally relax. As she lay there, the man went about his tasks in the cabin. She could hear the soft sounds of him working, preparing for the next steps. He didn't speak much, but she could sense that he was focused, alert, and always thinking ahead. Emily felt a deep sense of gratitude for him. She realized that, without him, she and Max might never have made it to safety. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift off into a deep, much-needed sleep. The storm outside still raged on, but she no longer feared it. With the man's presence and the safety of the cabin, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. Hours passed, though Emily had no sense of time. When she woke up again, the fire was still crackling in the hearth, and the storm outside had calmed, though it still lingered in the distance. She stretched, feeling more rested than she had in what seemed like forever, and looked over at Max, who was still asleep beside her. The man was sitting by the fire, looking out the window. He turned when he heard Emily stir. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice calm but warm. Emily nodded, sitting up slowly. "Much better," she said. "Thank you." He smiled. "You're welcome. We'll wait for the storm to clear up before heading out. It's still a bit too dangerous to travel." Emily didn't argue. She knew he was right. They had made it this far, and now wasn't the time to rush. They needed to wait until the storm had passed completely, and only then would it be safe to leave the cabin. As she sat up, stretching and feeling the weight of her body's recovery, Emily thought about how much her life had changed in just a few short hours. From the desperation of being lost in the storm to the safety of the cabin, everything had shifted. She had no idea who this man was or how he had found them, but one thing was clear. He had saved her and Max when there seemed to be no hope left, and for that, she would always be grateful. For now, they were safe, and that was all that mattered. The storm would eventually end and they would move on. But Emily knew that this experience would stay with her forever, a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how a single act of kindness could change everything. The morning light broke through the small window of the cabin, casting a soft glow on everything inside. The storm outside had subsided, though the wind still howled faintly in the distance. Emily sat up slowly, feeling a bit more like herself, after a long, deep sleep. She stretched her arms above her head, savoring the relief that came with resting in a safe place. Her body felt sore, but it was a different kind of soreness now, one that came from rest and recovery rather than the sharp pain of the cold and exhaustion. Max, who had been curled up beside her all night, stirred and stretched as well. He let out a soft bark and trotted over to the small fire that was still burning in the hearth. His tail wagged and his eyes brightened as he sniffed the air. Emily smiled at him, grateful for his company. She could tell he was feeling better, too. He wasn't trembling anymore, and his energy seemed to be returning. The ranger, who had been quietly sitting by the window, turned as Emily woke up. "Good morning," he said with a warm smile. There was a calmness about him, a steady presence that seemed to make everything feel all right no matter what had happened the day before. Emily returned the smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice still a little rough from the cold. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how we would have made it without you." The man shrugged modestly. "It's my job. I'm just glad I could be there when you needed help." He stood up and moved toward the small kitchen area, preparing some coffee for both of them. Emily took a moment to let everything sink in. The storm had cleared up, the worst of it was over, and they had made it through the night. The man had saved them, had led them to safety when all seemed lost. It was hard to believe that only a day ago she had been certain they were going to die out there in the storm. As the man handed her a steaming cup of coffee, she looked at him again, noticing more details about him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy confidence that came from experience. His face, though weathered from spending so much time in the wild, was kind. His dark eyes held a quiet strength, and there was something about him that made Emily feel like he had seen and done a lot in his life, things that had shaped him into the person he was now. She still didn't know his name, but she felt as though she could trust him completely. Max padded over to Emily's side, resting his head on her lap. She absent-mindedly scratched his ears, feeling a wave of gratitude for the little dog who had been with her through all of this. If it hadn't been for Max, she might have given up long before the man had appeared. It was the thought of Max that had kept her going when she had wanted to curl up and let the storm take her. The man took a seat across from her, sipping his own coffee. "So what happened out there?" he asked gently. "I mean, how did you end up in such a bad spot?" Emily took a deep breath, the memories of the storm rushing back to her. She had tried to push them to the back of her mind, but now that she was safe, it was impossible to ignore the fear, the exhaustion, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness she had felt. "I thought I could handle it," she began, her voice quieter now. I've hiked in the mountains before. I thought I knew what I was doing, but the weather changed so fast. I thought I could make it to the summit and back before the storm hit, but I didn't make it in time. The snow started coming down so hard, and before I knew it, I was lost. The wind was so strong and everything looked the same. I couldn't find my way back. She paused, taking a sip of her coffee to steady herself. I tried to stay calm, but it's hard when you're alone out there, and everything feels like it's closing in on you. I couldn't even tell which direction to go. It felt like the storm was swallowing me up. The man nodded as she spoke, his expression soft but understanding. It happens more often than you think, he said. The mountains can be unpredictable. Sometimes it only takes a few minutes for conditions to go from manageable to dangerous. That's why it's so important to always be prepared and to turn back when things start to get bad. You did the right thing by trying to find shelter. Emily shook her head. But I didn't do enough. I should have known better. I should have turned around earlier. The man leaned forward, his gaze steady. The thing is, you made it through. You stayed focused when you could, and you didn't give up. That's what matters. And you weren't alone. You had Max with you, and you kept going for him. That's a strong bond. Sometimes that's all it takes to get through something like this. Emily looked down at Max, who was now curled up contentedly on her lap, his eyes half closed as if he too was reflecting on the ordeal. She smiled softly at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for her loyal companion. He had kept her going when her own strength was fading. The man stood up and started packing up some of his gear. I'm going to check the weather again and make sure it's safe to head out. We can't stay here forever, but we'll wait until it's clear enough to move. Emily nodded, feeling a little reluctant to leave the safety of the cabin, even though she knew it was necessary. The storm might have passed, but the mountains could still be dangerous. She had no idea where they were, but she trusted the man's judgment. He was experienced, and if anyone knew how to navigate the wilderness, it was him. As the man moved to the door, he turned back to her. I know you're probably anxious to get going, but it's important that we take our time. You've been through a lot. Max has been through a lot too. We need to make sure we're both ready before we head out. Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at his kindness. She didn't feel anxious to leave anymore. The man had given her something far more valuable than just shelter. He had given her hope, a sense of calm when she had felt overwhelmed and lost. She realized now that in a way he had saved them twice, not just from the storm, but from the fear that comes when you feel like you're truly alone. I'm not in any hurry, she said softly. I trust you. We'll wait until it's safe. The man nodded and smiled before stepping out into the still cold morning air to check the weather. Emily looked down at Max, who was now awake and wagging his tail. She patted his head and whispered softly, We made it, buddy. We really did. As the hours passed, the storm finally cleared completely. The winds died down, and the sun started to break through the clouds. Emily and the man both knew it was time to go, but she didn't feel as anxious as she had before. With the man's calm presence and Max by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The man returned, his eyes scanning the sky. The weather's clear, he said, his tone steady. We can make our way down the mountain now. It's not too far to the nearest trailhead. We'll take it slow. Emily stood up, feeling surprisingly strong for someone who had nearly given up the day before. She gathered her gear, helped Max to his feet, and followed the man out of the cabin. The sun shone down, glistening on the snow, and the world seemed almost peaceful now, as if the storm had never happened. But Emily knew that she would never forget the experience, how close she had come to losing everything, and how the kindness of a stranger had saved her and her dog. They walked together, side by side, Max trotting happily in front of them. The man led the way, showing her how to navigate the snow-covered terrain, and Emily followed step by step, feeling grateful for the second chance she had been given.